White initiates with a solid central pawn push, establishing control and maintaining dynamic balance. Black responds with a sound development, mirroring White's control and keeping the position balanced. White expands on the queenside, creating tension and solidifying the central presence. Black supports the central pawns, solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for further development. White develops the knight, adding a piece to the central struggle and maintaining equality. Black pins the knight, disrupting White's pawn structure and maintaining a dynamic balance. White reinforces the center with a pawn, preparing for kingside castling. The move the pawn to c5 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was short castles, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to d3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to b6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows short castles, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops another knight, reinforcing the center and preparing for castling. Black castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks. White develops the bishop, aiming towards the black kingside and maintaining central influence. Black pushes a central pawn, breaking open lines and maintaining pawn structure balance. White castles kingside, ensuring king safety and unifying the heavy pieces. Black captures a central pawn, challenging White's pawn structure and maintaining equality. White recaptures, activating the bishop and reinforcing central control. Black prepares development on the queenside, potentially eyeing open files. White centralizes the queen, supporting the pawn and preparing for pawn structure changes. Black exchanges pawns, simplifying the center and clarifying the pawn structure. White recaptures, opening the e-file and strengthening the central pawn presence. Black develops the bishop, activating it to the long diagonal and preparing queenside pressure. White pins the knight, creating tactical pressure and preparing piece exchanges. Black exchanges bishop for knight, disrupting White's pawn structure on the queenside. White recaptures with the pawn, creating doubled pawns but opening the c-file. Black develops the knight, supporting the central pawns and preparing for a queenside advance. The move the bishop to d3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to h4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the queen to c7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to g3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the f-file to c1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to h5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black centralizes the queen, connecting rooks and preparing for queenside play. White develops the bishop to a passive square, maintaining equality but missing tactical chances. Black activates the rook on the open c-file, increasing queenside pressure. The move the pawn to c4 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook on the f-file to e1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the knight to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to e4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight on rank 5 to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. The move the rook on the f-file to e8 by Black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to g4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook on the f-file to d8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook on the f-file to d1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to c6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes a rook, reinforcing the defensive structure and maintaining equality. The move the queen to d6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on f3, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the queen takes on f3 executes a favorable trade, which enables the pawn to e5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to e3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d4 executes a favorable trade, continuing with the queen takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White repositions the bishop, aiming to control key central squares. The move the queen to f4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook on the f-file to c1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to g4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to h3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on f3 executes a favorable trade, continuing with the queen takes on f3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the queen to d2 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to d2, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to e5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black captures the queen, a solid move that simplifies the position. White recaptures with the knight, activating the piece and centralizing it. Black places the rook on an open file, increasing pressure on white's queenside. White retreats the bishop, a solid move that maintains the positional balance. The move the knight to e8 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to b8, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to a4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to a6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook on the e-file to c1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to e8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to a5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to a4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook on the e-file to c1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the knight to b8, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to a4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to a6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to a5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black retreats the knight, a solid move to consolidate the queenside. White advances the flank pawn, gaining space and restricting black's queenside. Black pushes the b-pawn, creating counterplay and contesting the queenside. White activates the rook on the b-file, applying pressure to black's queenside structure. The move the knight to d6 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the bishop to a6, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Afterwards, the pawn on the c-file takes on b5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the rook takes on b5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on c3, executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook to b7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to a6 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to b4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Afterwards, the knight takes on c4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on c4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the b-file takes on c4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the bishop to c5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to a6, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop takes on a6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight takes on a6, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the pawn to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to e4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the bishop takes on e4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White places the bishop on a strong outpost, dominating key squares and increasing the advantage. Black activates the rook on the 7th rank, preparing for defense. White captures the pawn, solidifying the queenside majority and maintaining decisive pressure. Black develops the bishop, aiming to contest the long diagonal. The move the knight to b3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to b4, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the bishop to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook on the c-file to d8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the bishop to a5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to e4 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the bishop to d5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the knight to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the knight to f5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to a6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White activates the rook, reinforcing the central control and maintaining overwhelming activity. The move the rook takes on c1 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to a8, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the bishop to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to c5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the rook to c7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the knight takes on e6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White recaptures, dominating the open file and solidifying the decisive advantage. Black repositions the bishop, maintaining a solid defensive setup. White centralizes the knight, aiming to control key squares and restrict black's mobility. Black repositions the rook, holding the position despite the overwhelming disadvantage. The move the knight to d3 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to a4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the rook to e8, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to f5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on a7, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black repositions the rook to the 7th rank, maintaining defensive activity. White repositions the knight, maintaining pressure and central control. The move the rook to c8 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to d7, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the knight takes on d5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the rook to c7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to b6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the rook, applying pressure and maintaining the strong advantage. The move the bishop to b7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to b3, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the rook takes on a7, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the rook to c1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to f2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the knight, consolidating the advantage and preparing for further advances. Black moves the knight, maintaining defensive solidity. White captures the rook, consolidating the material advantage and simplifying towards a win. Black captures the knight, a solid move that doesn't alter the decisive outcome. White captures the pawn, maintaining the decisive material advantage and pressure. Black repositions the knight, holding the position. White advances the flank pawn, further restricting black's space.